I actually just want to pick up on one of Michael's comments, which I thought was really interesting. And I think because it relates to some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today. It was intriguing to me how he talked about the fact that it doesn't matter what your political stripe is in terms of caring about communities. And I actually really agree with him on that. My interaction, which is usually at a federal level, is that most members of parliament are elected because they have a genuine desire to improve their communities. And that could be they come from a small business community, they come from big business, agriculture, whatever it might be, but they're there to actually help the people in their constituencies. But for us, the way that unfold might be different. So the ideology of a liberal member of parliament or a conservative member of parliament might be different, but the end game of bettering the communities can be the same. And it's an interesting time because we're living in a minority parliament. So this is you're going to see is actually going to come into play in a little bit of the things that I'm going to talk with you about today. So what I'm going to do is really talk a bit about a few areas. One is kind of a spotlight file or issue that we're working on literally right now. I mean, we have teams on the Hill today that are talking about this particular issue. Talk about some of the other files that are really important to the sector, and then just share a few thoughts or observations about what I believe in looking at some of the more successful advocacy efforts are ingredients in the recipe that would be successful. But before doing that, I just want to just sort of frame Imagine Canada's participation. So if you're not familiar with us, we're a national registered charity. What we seek to do is improve the operating environment in which social good, charities, nonprofits, social entrepreneurs function so that they can have success in their communities. As part of our strategic planning framework, we have 4 strategic directions. One is called Influence Our Environment. So Imagine Canada works exclusively at a federal level. We don't do provincial or municipal advocacy. And in our strategy document, we frame our 4 strategic directions with what we call game-changing outcomes. For us, Influence Our Environment speaks to the political and regulatory environment at a federal level. And the outcome for us there is a Canada where government considers the contributions and needs of charities, nonprofits, and social enterprises when public policy, funding programs, legislation, and regulation are being developed and implemented. And for us, what the subtext of this is that we fundamentally believe that the types of communities that we both enjoy and have come to expect are the result of a tripartite relationship. And if you look at our logo, there's a triangle in it. And what that represents is the coming together of government. And we've witnessed the power of government during the pandemic, like certainly I've never seen before. The private sector, who works to employ Canadians, to provide wealth, and not as junior partners, not as the third sector, but the other contributor to the completion of the triangle are charities, nonprofits, and social enterprises who work to build the fabric, the social fabric of our communities. And so our work is to ensure, and our aspiration, our outcome is to ensure whenever this work is being done, that our sector is considered as part of the solution to making Canada better. So with that, what I'm going to do is spend a little bit of time talking about what I kind of call a spotlight file. It's sort of a real life example of one of these things that is dominating a lot of time, will affect a lot of organizations. And it's very timely and kind of gives you a sense as to where things are at. And the file, this is the technical slide in a way. And the issue is direction and control. And if you're not familiar with the term, direction and control regulations require charities to exercise full direction and control over their own activities. And these words are in quotation marks for a reason. Whenever they work with partners without a formal charitable status, which really leaves charities with 2 options: to only work with actors legally recognized as charities, or in the case of Canadian rules and regulations, to engage in one-sided partnerships whereby the local actors our sector aims to support are regulated to an intermediary role. So the term direction and control is actually not found in the Income Tax Act. It's found in CRI guidance that's based on 2 words, own activities, that are actually found in the Income Tax Act. But what does this mean in real language? What does this mean in terms of day-to-day life? Well, the implications for this and how it sort of unfolds is it's particularly relevant for organizations, registered charities who seek to work with non-charitable partners to fulfill their charitable purpose or their mission. In Canada, that might look something like an organization that wants to work with an Indigenous organization. So a Canadian charity that wants to work with an Indigenous organization. That Indigenous organization is a nonprofit, it's a collective, it's a co-op, it's a neighborhood association, it's not a registered charity. Or it could be in a global context. You could be an organization that's working overseas, and the organization that you're partnering with to, provide hurricane relief or dig a well, whatever those might be, are not recognized Canadian charities. As a result, the direction and control regime kicks in. And it has been a challenging system, because what it really means is that the Canadian charity, the charity itself, must direct and control everything. So they have to have separate books and records to account for things. I mean, and it goes incredibly detailed down to the last dollar. If, for example, you were partnering with an Indigenous organization for a really interesting program on a reserve, the Indigenous organization invented the program, worked with you, but they really were the drivers of the program and created intellectual property that's actually owned by the charity, not the Indigenous organization. And as you can imagine, in an era of truth and reconciliation, that does not speak to the spirit of it. Organizations in the global context can't participate in pooled global funds, because once those dollars disappear into the big pool, the Canadian charity can't exert direction and control on it. And essentially, this way of working represents a patriarchal colonial system. And for about 3 decades, Canadian organizations have been trying to get this changed. Well, in budget 2022, there was some announcements, and they relate to this. But prior to budget 2022, we've been working with Senator Ratna Amadvar on what is now known as Bill S-216, the Effective and Accountable Charities Act. And this act amends the Income Tax Act to permit charities to provide their resources to a person who's not a qualified donee, provided that they take reasonable steps to ensure these resources are used exclusively for charitable purpose. So the idea behind Bill S-216, and I should note that it passed the Senate. It's gone through the first reading, second readings coming up on May 16th in the House of Commons. It's actually going back to this idea that it doesn't matter what political party you are. It's actually introduced into the House by Conservative member Philip Lawrence and seconded by NDP member Heather McPherson. And so there is cross-party support for this particular bill. Essentially, what it would do is would provide more flexibility and a more respectful working relationship between charities and non-charities. It would do so, though, in a manner that does not reduce accountability. And I think that's a critical element to consider, because we actually want an accountable system. We want to make sure that dollars that donors give are used for the charitable purpose of the mission for which the organization is working on. And so this act has been continuing to go through the system with a bit of wind in its sails. Well, about a month ago, budget 2022 comes out, and it addressed two things. And I'll speak to one a little bit later, which is the disbursement quota. And it changed the disbursement quota, which would infuse more dollars into the charitable sector. But one of the policy objectives that the government had in consulting with the sector around changing the disbursement quota was to ensure that more dollars would go to organizations serving vulnerable populations. The sector was very clear in its response that simply changing the disbursement quota alone and making more money available was not going to fulfill the policy objective of serving vulnerable populations if you didn't address the direction and control rules. So budget 2022 both addressed the disbursement quota and had this statement in it, which was to ensure sufficient flexibility for charities to carry out their work. Budget 2022 proposes to amend the Income Tax Act to allow a charity to provide its resources to organizations that are not qualified donees, provided that the charity meets certain requirements designed to ensure accountability. This is intended to implement the spirit of Bill S-216, the Effective and Accountable Charities Act, which is currently being considered by Parliament. So as you can imagine, on budget day, the reaction from sector leadership who've been working on this was cautious optimism. So not at the finish line, but you can actually see the finish line in sight. Well, the devil can be in the details sometimes. And next up was the Budget Implementation Act. So the budget is like a vision statement. The Budget Implementation Act is the piece of legislation that would bring the vision of the budget to life. Unfortunately for us, the language of the Budget Implementation Act doesn't meet our needs. It retains the most concerning aspects of the current regulations and adds additional layers. So our work right now as a sector is to amend the Budget Implementation Act before it's passed into law. One could actually argue that not only has the details of the Budget Implementation Act not only not made it better, it's actually made it worse. Because direction and control remains, this paternalistic regulatory regime is in place. There's new administrative burden because what's essentially happened is the government is proposing to take all of the processes and requirements from an administrative perspective and put them in like in the law. They've codified, sorry about that, making it far more difficult to change them in the future. And new pooled funding rules that will severely restrict shared platforms. So the ability, again, to participate as collectives is really limiting. So again, the finish line just got a little bit further away, actually, now that we're working on this piece of work on the Budget Implementation Act. So what's happening with it right now? Well, there's a collective of allies that's working to have this amended before it's passed. And these include the Senator, MP Lawrence. There's about 37 charity lawyers who have come together and written 2 letters to the government to describe their concerns around the current regime and the proposed language. And it's an interesting group to think about it because for the most part, when you think about who the big winners are in a more complex, legally restrictive regime, it's charity lawyers because they get hired to do the work to help organizations figure this all out. They've actually come forward and said, this is no longer a good way of working. It hasn't been for a while and we need a change. Cooperation Canada, which is the umbrella organization that serves the international development community, Philanthropic Foundations of Canada, as you can imagine, many funders deal with this. So right now, we've got 3 Hill Days going on. They kicked off with a virtual one yesterday. We've got teams in Ottawa today that are crisscrossing the Hill. There'll be meetings through next week to try and ensure that members of Parliament, particularly members of the House Finance Committee, hear this message. If this gets passed with this current language, it's making it way more problematic. So I think there was a question, about market research or media and those kinds of things in the last session. We are looking to engage that tactic. So there's an op-ed that's been co-authored by Cooperation Canada, PFC, and ourselves that we will look to revise at end of day tomorrow based on our hearings over the last 3 days, and then get placed in key political publications and if possible, more widely shared. And what's actually changed since I did the presentation is tomorrow, I'll be presenting to the House Finance Committee in their hearings on the Budget Implementation Act. So we've been bringing, and I think it's important to note here that this is a true collective effort. Because the organizations who are most affected are engaged. I should also note that the allies that are there include representatives from groups like the Network for Advancement of Black Communities, Black Moms Connection, the Circle of Philanthropy on Indigenous Peoples. So ensuring that not just the funding side, but the actual non-qualified donee side is in the room having the conversations with parliamentarians is critically important. So, as we think about our world and the work that we're at, we've got a red hot file right now that we are trying to get resolved in a manner that will actually improve the environment for charities and nonprofits. But I did want to speak to a few additional files before some closing thoughts. These first 2 are sort of what I would call foundational files. And one is that in Canada, the law for charities is essentially stuck. So in our country, I'll speak to, the law continually evolves because it's tested. People bring cases to court. But in the case of charity law, where most of the stuff federally is in relation to rulings by CRA and working with charities, unfortunately, right now, the only appeal mechanism is to go to the Federal Court of Appeal. And there's two problems with that. One is it's really expensive, so that organizations don't necessarily have the dollars to do it. And two, the only way the charity will win is if the judge indicates that there is an error in law. So no new information is allowed to be introduced into that process. So in a sense, the cards are stacked against the charity. So if deciding whether to go and spend all this money to appeal a decision where we can't introduce any new information, the likelihood of success is fairly low. Most charities then won't challenge it, which means very, very few cases are going to the courts, and charity law is not evolving. So one of the recommendations, and this has come from multiple sources, foundations, it was part of the Senate committee, and as well the advisory committee on the charitable sector has supported the idea of changing the appeals process related to these types of decisions to go to the tax court. They're usually tax type decisions anyway, but it would allow for both a less costly route and the opportunity for the charity to introduce its side. So this is sort of a foundational file that's been cooking for a while. We're looking for an element to warm up so that we can get this one through. The second is that we are a sector without a home. And this actually is perhaps one of the more frustrating ones, is that as a sector that employs 2.4 million Canadians, is 8.3% of gross domestic product, has close to 13 million volunteers every year, there is no place in the federal government for us to go and have a conversation about holistic public policy. Our natural conversation is with CRA, but CRA is the regulator. They're there to do their job, ensuring that the rules as set out are followed. We actually support a strong CRA because accountability and trust is important in our sector, but they're not there to create enabling and holistic public policy. There's nowhere in the government for our sector to go. Subsectors may have places. The environmental community can speak to the environment minister. Health charities can speak to the health minister, but nobody that actually looks after the health and well-being of the sector itself. We've seen, even in the last 2 years, progress being made at a provincial level. There's now a parliamentary secretary in British Columbia. There's a new setup in Newfoundland and Labrador. And even just 2 weeks ago in the United States, an announcement about the creation of the Office of Nonprofit Affairs inside the White House. We are now at a federal level very quickly becoming a jurisdiction that is alone in terms of having people that really understand our sector. And I would also argue some of the political bungles that have happened over the last number of years have taken place because there are not knowledgeable people inside government that really understand our sector and can advise both senior civil servants and politicians about our sector. So this is a signature and key policy file for us to realize that we can have a place to have a more holistic approach, and that should be also within the permanent machinery of government. But other files that are being worked on, Bill C-240, I call it the Don Johnson file. If you've been in the fundraising world for a while, Don Johnson, a former banker who has really driven this. I call him the little engine that could, because this guy's relentless. MP Marty Morantz has picked this up now, and this would be to change the capital gains treatment for donations to private shares in real estate. Another one that we're still trying to make sure crosses the finish line, the $400 million Community Services Recovery Fund that was announced actually in Budget 2021. And we're hoping, our latest information is that the portals for applications should be open through the intermediary organizations in the summer. Grants and contributions reform. I think we've witnessed during the pandemic the short-sightedness of short-term giving or short-term grants, focus on project-based, not allowing organizations dollars for people, technology, etc. We were ill prepared to start the pandemic. We need to change that at a federal government level around grants and contribution. One that we've commented on, which is prevention and revocation of charitable status for misinformation related to abortions. There's a principle here. The government is seeking to, again, codify this. It's actually already codified. Charities and organizations are charities are required to be honest. And make sure that we are using good data in all of our work. This is an unnecessary step. And of course, the disbursement quota, which was resolved in budget 22 and recently budget 2022 and recently raised. What's interesting in this one is that the government did a good job of listening to the sector in a couple of key areas. One being ensuring that there is a regular review. So there'll be a 5-year review of the disbursement quota. So it's still active in the sense that one of the foundational pieces of the disbursement quota debate still needs to be articulated better. And that is, what's the data that we have for the starting point of the conversation? I think anybody who's a part of that one would understand that we just did not, within the sector nor with government, have a common data starting point. So just some thoughts on tactics, because some organizations are hugely involved in public policy advocacy. Others not so much. Some are just dipping their toes in the water, as related to the advocacy chill question from before. So rather than specific tactics to start off with, I just wanted to mention a few ingredients in the secret sauce that I've noted work well. One is this idea of being stronger together. And that if we look at successful policy files, political activities, inclusion in federal pandemic programs, I mean, those dollars now are over $6 billion in investment since the start of the pandemic in charities. Our sector has been more successful when we can create collective strength. When politicians and staff were being bombarded by messages from a wide array of groups, being able to act in a cohesive manner builds confidence that the change that we want to see is widely supported. Think about it from their perspective. Are we going to announce this and get a standing ovation, or are we going to be widely criticized? The more that we can show strength in doing that, the better. But we have to recognize it's sometimes slower, it's more complex, and it's more difficult to create agreement, but it can pay exponential dividends. And again, even going to the spotlight file of the Budget Implementation Act, the fact that we have multiple organizations at a national level, their members coming together with a senator is getting noticed. And we're actually starting to hear this going into meetings. Oh yeah, we're hearing about this, this is a problem. Now we just got to get them to fix it. The second thing is around building a buzz. And it speaks to that question earlier about market research. Those in government, both the political staff in particular and the MPs, pay keen attention to what's happening in the media and online. So creating opportunities for your cause or issue to be showcased, which can then be sent to politicians and civil servants, is a powerful way to build momentum. This is an important point too. Just because it's in the media doesn't mean that it gets noticed. Part of what we seek to do is to say, what's our mechanism to say, there was a story in the Sudbury Star, and wham, we're now on social media tagging ministers, MPs, or their staff and pointing them to it, to make sure that we're not making the assumption that it's actually seen. And, for example, just speaking to something we worked on, we commissioned market research that showed that a majority of Canadians support the idea of a home in government. So last fall, we went in, commissioned a poll, talked to Canadians, and essentially are now saying to all three parties, you all win if you support this. There is widespread support and a bit of perplexity as to why this doesn't already exist. So this is not a dangerous file for you. This is one that you can feel good that Canadians writ large support. And the third thing is around persistence and staying power. Changes in public policy rarely happen in the short term. Sometimes they do. Things catch fire and away they go, but most often they don't. And I think Michael spoke to that earlier in terms of time. So ensuring your organization is dedicating energy and resources to telling your story, crafting messages, and adapting to the multitude of changes along the way will be essential ingredients in a public policy strategy. In deciding to have an advocacy strategy, success should be measured in months and years. It's unlikely to happen in weeks. And as well, if you yourselves don't have the capacity, you can still participate in the campaigns or efforts set up by provincial or national umbrella organizations. Throughout the pandemic, we did these things that are called New Mode, which is the piece of technology, where we invited organizations to send customized letters or emails to their members of parliament and a select group, Minister of Finance, Prime Minister, etc. I actually went on and timed it. It took less than 30 seconds to customize it with your name, your postal code, and your organization. And then you could, if you wanted to, you could actually change the letter. Any organization can participate. And I'll be honest with you, if there is a weakness in our system right now, it is our collective inability to leverage the strength of the 86,000 registered charities and 90,000 nonprofits to a place where we get noticed on a regular basis. Canadians care about the things that we work on. And we've seen this through the pandemic, 1 in 2 charities indicating an increase in demand for their services. Then there's a menu of tactics: one-to-one meetings, caucus meetings, lobby days like we're doing, storytelling, research reports, showcasing progress in other jurisdictions. Boy, if you're working at a municipal or provincial level as well, generally members of parliament or local councillors don't like hearing that they're behind, and being able to show real examples in other jurisdictions is happening. And Michael mentioned this as well, providing recognition when due. If the only time they ever hear from us is when we're criticizing, critical, or sometimes just plain old complaining, that's not a very effective relationship. We wouldn't manage our donor relationships, our volunteer relationships, or our staff relationships the same way. So we shouldn't manage our relationships with politicians and government officials that way. If they do something good, let's let them know. Let's let our constituents know that something positive was accomplished. It goes a long way to building a strong relationship, so that when you need to have those more critical conversations, the appetite is there to be able to do that in a respectful manner. So sort of a final thought before we open it up for some questions. Nothing will change if organizations in our sector don't get in the game. And yes, there was an advocacy chill during the political activities days. Those rules have been fundamentally changed. And while it's, we don't expect that organizations are going to spend huge amounts of dollars on advocacy and lobbying, without some participation, our voice is silent. And without a strong chorus of organizations, sometimes singing off the same song sheet, sometimes not, because consensus is almost impossible, we will not succeed in our shared aspirations to make the operating environment more enabling, so that your missions and your causes can be more successful. So that can be everything from just participating in a phone call. It could be attending a meeting. It could be sending an email. It could be participating in a piece of research. All of those things contribute to the betterment of our sector. So, with that, Puneet, I think I'll stop sharing, and we'll see if there's any questions that have come in.
Thank you so much, Bruce. That was fascinating. Again, that's what I would call, that's a whole lot of GR going on, right? You've got a lot of activity going on at Imagine Canada at the federal level. I love that list of tactics, and I love it because it's exactly what you said. There are so many small ways, different ways for nonprofits to get involved. There's the technology, like you said, that takes 30 seconds, that you put in your postal code and you're able to send an advocacy letter to your MP. It's amazing what can be done. So we do have a few questions. One of the there's 2 questions in the chat. There's 1 question in the Q&A, and I'm going to go with the Q&A one first, because it's sort of challenging Imagine Canada's home and government initiative. So the question says, the idea for a home for the sector is important, but does it need to be in government? This would make this new home more vulnerable to the political ecosystem. A fair comment, for sure. Perhaps an independent social sector agency? Do you have any thoughts on that, Bruce?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there's as many opinions about what the actual mechanism or instrument is as there is the question. But what I will do is I will address this from what I would call a strategic perspective. So I agree. I think that was John that put that in. I agree that a mechanism that is visibly subject to the whims of political ideology can be at risk. So the recommendation that Imagine Canada has been supporting over the last number of years is actually a department. So not necessarily a minister or even a parliamentary secretary, but what we've suggested, because our analysis based on what we want this home to do suggests that the best place would be to have a whole team of civil servants inside something like, I said, industry science and economic development, and put us side by side with small business. Because a lot of the work that we need our home in government to do is less about political stuff, and it's more about fixing broken links between government and removing regulatory barriers between government departments. And so we actually need a group of civil servants who are highly knowledgeable. On the other downside, so if you look what happened in New Zealand, they went through a big process of creating a charity commission a number of years ago. And then a few years later, the government of the day said, well, we don't really value that. And they cut all their funding. So this independent organization essentially disappeared or had any effectiveness. And there have been other models, but right now we're sort of leaning towards a machinery of government model that allows us to fulfill these key strategic objectives.
Great, yeah, and I think that there are people who it's great that we can challenge these ideas, right? And thank you for that honest answer. So I think you can see the question in the chat. I don't know if you've had time to read it because you were answering a question, but
Yeah.
Can you give examples of the types of organizations you're referring to in the direction and control in the global pool? So maybe you could just touch upon the players in that direction and control and who's affected by that.
Yeah. So on a global scale, I mean, it would be organizations like Save the Children or CARE, or any of the traditional folks that you might think are out there providing services overseas. Every time they either want to enter a global pool or they want to enter into a new service relationship in another country, the direction and control rules come into play. In Canada, and this is another interesting one, because I think that the place for exponential growth, where more organizations are going to bump into these archaic rules, is actually domestically. We are going as a nation through a reckoning as it relates to anti-racism and anti-oppression and truth and reconciliation. Well, you look at the creation of the $200 million Black Endowment Fund that was set up. Well, something like less than 1% of funding goes to Black-led organizations right now. Well, if we don't change these rules, that money's not going to flow to organizations serving the Black community, just in this example, that serve the Black community that are not registered charities. Or the only way it can is through these archaic, costly, administratively burdensome, patriarchal, and problematic rules and regulations. And so what I believe is that as more Canadian domestic organizations seek to do work in our country with Indigenous organizations, Black-led organizations, serving vulnerable populations, they're going to bump into these. They may not have in the past, but they're about to if we don't get them fixed.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Bruce. There is another question in the chat. Is the Budget Implementation Act related to the federal budget broadly or related to the Effective and Accountable Charities Act? Can you speak to that?
Sure. So the BIA, as we call it, is directly related to the budget. The interesting part here is that there is also a clause in the Budget Implementation Act that basically says that if passed, it would supersede Bill S-216. So let's just assume these two horses cross the finish line. Budget Implementation Act is passed and Parliament passes Bill S-216. The government's put a clause in the BIA that says this one no longer counts. And for us, this one is actually the better piece of legislation. So they're separate pieces of legislation, but they are interrelated.
Thanks for clearing that up. I have a question of my own. So these rules that are rigid, that don't make any sense for charities and nonprofits, where do they come from? What can we attribute this? Because it seems to me that a big part of your work, Bruce, at Imagine Canada would be to educate government around the impact that these rules have. But the first question I have is, how did these rules come to exist in the first place when it's clear that they hinder the work of nonprofits? We have a great history of nonprofits and volunteerism in Canada, but on the other hand, we've got rules that hinder their ability to do good work. Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that these particular rules have been around for a long time, and they reflected the intent of the day around the way organizations work. If you think about the evolution of international development or work with Indigenous organizations over the last 30 or 40 years, it's a 180-degree difference in terms of how organizations work. In Canada, however, unlike other jurisdictions, our rules have not evolved. And to be honest with you, Penny, this is a chronic issue. And it's one of the reasons why at Imagine Canada, our game-changing outcome is about in a sense, kind of a seat at the table and being part of this process to evolve. Because I continually say to government, you wouldn't make privacy legislation today based on a view of Canada from 1980. Internet hadn't been invented widely. Fax machines weren't even around. Of course not. Well, then why do you do it with our sector? Part of what we seek to have is an ongoing evolution of the rules. So I can't speak, because these are really old. I can't speak to what the thinking was, but I can tell you that it is not reflective of today's work, and they need to be changed.
Thank you again very much, Bruce.
My pleasure, and thanks for the opportunity. And if there's any questions for anyone after this, by all means, you can find me through the Imagine Canada website. Just reach out.
Yeah, that would be great.